Recently I made a video about the fastest rising god in Smite. That was Yemoja. And in that video I made you guys guess which god I was going to talk about, and there were quite a few different guesses, a few right ones, a few wrong ones, but one of them stood out as another god that has been rising a lot and making huge leaps in the meta. Have you already figured it out? Well, it's Camazotz. Today we're going to take a closer look at his development, his changes, and his current performance. We're also going to talk a little bit about changes to the playstyle here, because I think that is very important to note in this context. Now, if you're wondering who is actually rising more, I will say this beforehand, I haven't actually looked into it in detail because I haven't compared every single mode between Yemoja and Camazotz. Point is, they both started from the bottom and now they're here, and that's all we need to know. And when I say from the bottom, what does that mean for Camazotz? Well, looking at the Pro League, his last competitive game was roughly 4 months ago at this point, so 3 months ago after the SPL finished. That was in solo, and 2 months before that he was picked in jungle once. If we go back another month, then he becomes significantly more popular. This was around the time where he was frequently picked as a counter to King Arthur, and along with that he simply ended up in some other matchups as well. So he was just generally a little bit more popular. It's worth noting that with the exception of that one jungle game from Sam for Soccer, he was exclusively picked in solo lane, so not much of a jungle presence in the competitive scene at the moment. In ranked, his last stats before the buff were as follows. His win rate was 47.5% and his pick rate was 2.38%, with his ban rate being 0.08%, so not very popular. On the high levels of play, Platinum Plus, his win rate was slightly higher, 48%, and his pick rate was also ever so slightly higher, 2.88%, but his ban rate was even lower with 0.05%, so really he was very much out of the picture. What did Hyris have to say about him? This underworld creature has been underappreciated most of the year. Camazotz had a brief showing in the world's placement as a King Arthur counter, but aside from that, this god has rarely been seen in any level of play. Camazotz is seeing some big buff in this patch to focus on his primary design feature, lifesteal. His passive lifesteal is being increased on both abilities where it can be obtained, and his bonus healing is rising to prevent him from being easily countered by anti-heals. Finally, his leap range is increased to closer to the usual distance to help him chase or escape like the true assassin he is. Now, that already brings up an important point. One of the big problems for Camazotz is anti-heal, and anti-heal is just very, very common in the meta. We see Divine Ruin, we see Broader Speed Stick, and we see Pestilence or Contagion pretty much anywhere. The original idea of Camazotz was to give him relatively limited CC and not that much mobility outside of his ultimate, but in return give him very high damage and scaling values and that self-sustain. It kind of falls apart when the self-sustain isn't really there. So the changes that were made here were first of all to the passive. Essence Drinker increased passive buff from 6% to 8% physical lifesteal and increased healing. Then Vampire Bats, the 2, increased vampirism buff from 3 to 4%. And then Devour, the 3, increased range from 30 to 45 units. Now I actually went into jungle practice to check some things about how this lifesteal exactly works, because I had never looked into that in detail before. It's actually pretty straightforward. The passive itself simply gives you additional flat lifesteal, 8% from the start of the game. The Vampire Bats give you 4% lifesteal each when used against a big camp. That means previously you were able to get up to 15% lifesteal, and now you're able to get up to 20%. And the same is true for the healing increase. This can be pretty relevant, especially in the early stages of the game where the enemy can't necessarily go into anti-heal just yet, or it's a bit too much of an investment against Camazotz specifically. You can get quite a bit more healing out of the basics, but especially out of your abilities, because both your 2 and your 3 can heal you. To put it a bit into perspective, an example of using the 3 onto a cluster of 3 minions with full rank of the 3 as well as 200 power from items would previously give you 345 healing, and now it will give you 360 healing. The increase is not massive, but it does add up. If you hit 6 targets a full wave, or you, for example, use your 2 along with it, and you have high power scaling on that anyways, then the healing can of course increase more. I do believe that anti-heal will still strongly counter this of course, but it does help. The bigger change in my opinion is the change to Devour. The range increase from 30 to 45 units is massive. This ability had a lot of buffs in the past. It was originally very slow and it was very easy to hit Camazotz while doing it, until he got this basically instant immunity frame when leaping with it, and now it gets more range as well, meaning it feels entirely different from its starting point. What is worth noting is that the range increase here is to 45 units, whereas many other leaps are, I think, either 55 or 60 units. That is something that will throw you off, especially if you're playing him in the jungle at the moment. You need to get used to the walls that he can jump and the walls that he is unable to jump compared to other assassins, because sometimes he will just not be able to get over them and it can be very, very frustrating. Now that we've looked into the abilities, let's look at the stats and what impact these changes actually had. Looking at Arena, his stats did go up a fair bit. He got 4.5%, 4.6% extra win rate and is up to 47.61% now, but of course still not that good. It's just not his mode in any regard. He's not a big AoE teamfight god, so that's no surprise here really. He's still only at spot number 73. In Assault, where we have a similar situation, his win rate increased even less to 45% and he's now at spot number 82. I would also partially blame that on him having multiple line skill shots. So if you're getting him and you've never played him, then you're probably not going to perform very well with Camazotz specifically. In Conquest, however, we have a very different picture. Here his win rate went up by 5% to 52.44%, and he is currently in the 12th spot in terms of win rate. He was actually in the 8th spot the other day as well, so he's looking pretty good at the moment. It's not just because the Camazotz mains are back to playing him, his popularity has increased to spot number 19 by 85 spots overall. So most definitely a performance increase here across the board. We can see his damage and self-heal values going up as well. He's doing very good in Conquest. In Joust, his win rate also went up by 3%, but it's just shortly over 50% with spot number 46. So more towards the middle, but that makes sense for Joust. It's still a bit more teamfight oriented and you can make a few less single picks, but at the same time his damage is sufficient there. In Clash, we have a similar picture, with him being at 50% win rate in spot number 41. In Siege, he's also roughly around 50% in spot number 60, but Siege also has a smaller player base, so it's always hard to say what that's actually telling us. Looking at the development of his win rate in Conquest over the patches, we can see quite a drastic increase here, so the patch definitely changed something about that. Now earlier we looked at where he's played and we saw that in competitive he's almost exclusively played in solo, and I was trying to figure out if that's the case for Conquest in general as well, and it's a bit harder to figure that out, but there is a way to kind of do it, because what we can do is we can look at the most used items and determine if those are jungle or solo items. And what we can see here is that his most used items are Warrior Turbine, the Crusher and Jotun's Wrath. Especially Jotun's Wrath is very interesting to me. I did not think that was still so favored by many people, but it is what it is. And we can also see that after that we have Void Shield and then Gladiator's Shield. Now Gladiator's Shield is actually its own brief conversation that I want to have here. After having played him in solo, I am under the impression that Glad Shield doesn't necessarily help him that much anymore at this point. I think if with the amount of lifesteal that he has now and the amount of self-heal, you're building Glad Shield, you're making it easier for the enemy to counter you by very, very specifically going into anti-heal at that point, because then they counter your base heal that you have as a character and they counter the Glad Shield heal. I also saw FineOK running a build without Glad Shield, and I would say, at least in some matchup, this is probably going to be the way to go. And higher damage would help him more when he already is pretty stacked in terms of sustain anyways. But either way, it's safe to assume that this was built in solo builds. We can see that in Casual Conquest he's a bit more popular in the jungle, but still played in solo as well. And we can see the same thing reflected in the relics. We see a lot of Blink Rune, which you can build anywhere, but then also a lot of Purification Beads along with that. So combination of both, and Teleport Glyph being picked up a lot as well. What complicates this is that someone could build him very Brawler Bruiser style in solo lane and build Teleport Glyph and then Blink Rune or Purification Beads, and could also implement damaging items like the Crusher and Jotun's Wrath into their build, kind of inflating those items without actually playing him in any other role than solo. But we're gonna assume that at least a fair amount of it was in jungle. In ranked, taking a look across all ranks first, we see that his win rate is at 53.32% and putting him in spot number 14 we can see that he's most definitely successful. His ban rate is also increased to 3.84%, so people do think that he is a bit more scary than before. So overall, definitely an increase overall for him here. And with the pick rate decreasing, keep in mind that this is at least partially because he is also banned more, so he can be picked less in situations where people like to pick him. We can see that in ranked, the items are a little bit different. We see a higher emphasis on Void Shield here, we see Transcendence being valued more, Brawler's Beatstick showing up. And if we're going further down, we see items like Crusher, Heartseeker, Blackthorn Hammer, and Runic Shield. So a clear mix here of jungle builds and of solo builds, and maybe sometimes also like a brawler solo build. So he is played everywhere, even in ranked. Though I will say, looking at the builds that would come further up in higher levels of play, we see the builds shifting more towards solo overall. This is also indicated by Teleport being a more frequent pickup. His highest win rate right now, however, is actually in Duel. It's just not as much of an increase because he was actually pretty good in Duel already, unsurprisingly, being a very sustain heavy god with high single target burst. And here he is now in spot number 3. His overall win rate is 62%. We're going to skip over Jaws because the player base is too small to be relevant at all. And speaking of small player bases, if we look at ranked throughout the ranks, then we see his win rate being relatively low in bronze with 38%, but still having increased. Then in silver it is at 51%, increased by 5%. In gold it's at 49.5%, having increased by 8%. In platinum it's at 58.11%, which is a 5% increase here. And in diamond it's at 55.9%, while in masters it's at 50%. Generally speaking, you can see that there's a consistent increase. At the lowest level of play, people just struggle to utilize the character properly, which is unsurprising because he's not the easiest character to play. Then he stomps quite a fair bit on slightly higher ranks. I would guess that's also partially because people don't really build anti-heal there. And then he struggles a little bit around gold, where I'm assuming people start building anti-heal against him, and the mechanical skill just isn't there. But then in platinum, where the mechanical skill is there, the win rate goes even higher and then stays very high until almost the highest level of play. He has almost no games played in Grandmaster, so I'll leave that out. So generally speaking, it seems like Camazotz is a pretty good pick at the moment and definitely more successful than before, so the patch should be looked at as a success. Maybe pushing him a little bit too far in some levels of play, but so far it looks like it should be evening out okay. There are some things that I'd like to mention based on my experience that I had with him at this patch though. When I played him in the first games, I actually didn't feel like I was more impactful than before. One of the issues was that when I played him in solo, my jungler would not let me get the proc of the camp, so I wouldn't have the extra sustain that I needed. And if you don't get this extra sustain, then he doesn't feel that much more healthy than before, so to speak. He doesn't survive much better. You want to have those stacks maxed at all times to actually get all those increases. But more importantly, I generally didn't have the right idea of how to play him yet because I tried to play him the way he was played before. And especially when playing him in jungle, I realized that other play styles may actually be more effective. So what I tried was maxing the 3 after maxing the 2, and using the leap more aggressively as an early form of damage or as a way to return into the fight frequently, sustain up and keep fighting, rather than trying to use it as an escape. And you may be tempted to use it as an escape because it is still a decent leap, but I think overall, due to the high lifesteal on it, it has a much higher impact if you play it similar to, say, a Bakasura leap in some situations, or more closer to that, a Bastet leap. He is an aggressive character, and this ability plays into that, and the more aggressive you are with it, the more it pays off, and you can now use it to close the distance to an enemy that would otherwise get away. That playstyle, on the other hand, requires you to build a little differently so you don't get punished for leaping in like that. So I ended up having most success with a half damage pen focus build and a half bruiser build that allowed me to survive a little bit better while having these aggressive plays and having enough power to actually get good heals off my abilities. As much as it's tempting to go right into high power items like Transcendence, I also really liked a start with more pen items in order to utilize the early game as best as possible, but that's of course also personal taste to some extent. You can always consider swapping in higher power items like Heartseeker, like Erendite later on. And that's it for the Camazotz changes. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If all goes right, I might be able to release the what your warrior pick says about you tomorrow, so stay tuned for that, and if you haven't subscribed yet, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell so that you don't miss that. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.